here. So, welcome for those in person as well as those online for tonight for our event, The Future for Ukraine. This is being sponsored by the Political Science Club, so we appreciate their invitation. And overall, just as a quick run through of how we're going to be doing things, Dr. Kammerer in the Political Science Department is going to be our moderator. And so for those online, as you have questions, feel free to write them in on the Q&A online. And for those in person, we'll be handing out note cards. At any point, you can submit note cards with questions. So if something is interesting and you want to write it down, submit it, and then keep listening. Don't feel like you have to hold on to your thoughts. We love questions. The vast majority of this event, we want it to be questions. Because fundamentally, when it comes to the future for Ukraine, we do not have a crystal ball. We're not able to really consider what's going to happen as this conflict has escalated clearly very quickly. And so instead, what myself and Dr. Malliga Och in Global Studies is going to be doing is bringing a perspective of what we don't normally see in American media. So we're trying to bring in different perspectives. But we also, in that way, because the conflict has unfortunately gone on so long and has impacted so many, this is one of those things where we are going to still be presenting a fairly narrow presentation. Do not feel that your questions have to follow just our presentations. Ask big questions. We know more than these presentations, and we'd love to answer your questions. And if we don't, we'll let you know. But that being said, I'm going to go first, and in my presentation, I'm going to be looking a bit more at the domestic politics of Russia, what the response in Russia has been, do a quick check-in on sanctions and where we see those evolving, and then similarly looking at some of the larger allegations when it comes to crimes against humanity, genocide, and things like that. So, that being said, let's get going. So when we think about the Russian media landscape, it has shifted tremendously since the war began. The last independent radio station and the last independent TV station have both since closed. So now the number one and number two ways in which Russians get their information is completely state-owned and state-run. Similarly, the most famous newspaper, the Malliga Och, which won a Pulitzer Prize for its investigative journalism, cannot and will not print on the war. There are no articles being produced about the war. This is because of censorship laws passed on March 4th. So just a little while ago. And as a result of these laws, it is illegal to print or to broadcast the word war or protest the war. If you do so, the maximum fine is 15 years in prison. So when we consider this, still to this day, the Russian people hear that this is a special military operation. That is the only phrase that is used to describe the war. So we can imagine how the Russian public really don't quite understand, because of all of the last independent stations really closing and not being able to broadcast, they're not getting accurate information. But even worse, it is now illegal to spread quote unquote fake news regarding the Russian military as advocating for the return of troops or advocating for support of sanctions. So what this actually looks like on the ground is that if you even say bring our troops home, the state can decide to press charges. If you post an article about that you read on CNN somehow, on a social media platform, or you tell a neighbor, or you do something like that, they can report you and you are guilty of spreading fake news. Who determines what is fake news? The Russian state. Now, these laws could be struck down legally. They're very vaguely written, but it's very unlikely that we're going to see that kind of constitutional challenge. And similarly, when we look at the state TV broadcasts, they have shifted, and we have reports that over the last few weeks on the most popular TV station, Channel 1, that it has been up to 19 hours of punditry or news about Ukraine. So Russians aren't even getting news about Russia anymore. So when we thought that the propaganda was in pretty high gear since 2014, they have found several other gears beyond this. And so there really is a crowding out of the information space going on in Russia. But there nevertheless still is Russia. I checked an hour and a half before this presentation, and as of 15,440 protesters have been arrested. If you would like to follow that number, OBD/info, if you put that, or -info, if you put that into Google, you'll pull up the website. But Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter have also been banned from Russian internet. Really, Instagram is the most popular platform, so that has been a loss in terms of connection to the outside world. But what we are viewing is that Telegram, which is a Russian texting app, where from phone to phone it's encrypted, so it's very secure, that is still being allowed. Similarly, WhatsApp, even though it is owned by Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, WhatsApp is still being allowed to function. And so these have been the primary conduits for alternative information regarding the war. I'm not going to get into that in depth, but if in the Q&A you'd like to know more, there's certainly some very interesting things going on in this ecosystem of alternative information. But what we're observing is what we've been calling, or at least a number of people have been calling, defensive consolidation. And this is a response because Putin's approval ratings have increased. And in Russia, he roughly has an 83% approval rating. And when we normally think about a war, we think about a rally to the flag effect. That there is in some cases, a positive desire to come together, the nation is in crisis, we have to do something together. Defensive consolidation works slightly differently. You still get a consolidation, a desire to come together, but it can be negative. It's not necessarily positive. And so now we're worried about what this 83, what does that actually mean? And so when we look at experimental work, we do see a social herding effect. So based off experimental work in Russia, if you are to give someone an article that has a positive message about Putin versus a negative message about Putin, it causes your approval rating swing to go somewhere between 9 and 14%. So there's a chance that based on this experimental work, the higher end of that data, that maybe this 83% is more like 70% approval, which is still pretty high. But we are worried about those laws. How many people are answering these surveys truthfully? How many people are answering these in a sense of like, I want to give you my actual opinion, or do we still feel that coercive, that social herding effect? So we're not exactly sure how popular Putin is, but with numbers like this, he clearly has a lot of leeway in public opinion. And so that has been a shift that we might not have seen from the outside. Similarly, the Z symbol, as indicated here, this is a protest in Prof in Siberia. And so the Z symbol has emerged as a social signal in support of the war. I've put these in quotations because for everyday Russians, they still don't know it's a war. It's still a special military operation. And when they express support, what does that mean? Is it support in the sense that they want the war to increase in escalation in breadth? Is it that they will lose support and once they know it's a war and it's no longer a special military operation? Are they supporting because that's what the government is asking you to do and you're scared of repression? We're not sure what support means, but what we do know is that demonstrations around the letter Z have been popping up all over Russia. There are brigades of citizens going around putting Zs on buildings, and it's really adding this sense of really Russian society turning on itself, to where the state doesn't have to coerce its citizens into supporting the war. Citizens are doing that to themselves. And so that's one of the things that we're most worried about within Russian society, that there's the chance that it takes a more totalitarian sort of turn. We haven't seen evidence that that is total yet in Russia, but these are the things we're worried about, that even society is preventing the ability to disagree, not just the state. But we do have estimates that roughly 200,000 Russians have left Russia since February 24th, and I've seen some estimates as high as 300,000. So when we consider these numbers, what we're really seeing is that fundamentally, tens of thousands at a minimum have been fleeing. But just this last weekend, I saw ISU's production of a Chekhov play, Cherry Orchard. And this is a thing that comes up in a lot in Russian political philosophy, literature, in its overall intellectual circles, this question of what is Russia's relationship to the West, to Europe. And there's often this idea that, well, we shouldn't, that's not us, we shouldn't go there, we shouldn't become them. There's always this tension that emerges time and time and again. And in this case, this fleeing of 200,000 Russians estimated, it's not seen as we're in trouble, people are leaving. For some, it's seen as good. The pure Russians are staying. The people that want the West, that like the West, let them leave. They shouldn't stay here anyway. So again, we could see society turning in on itself and not recognizing the flight of a lot of Western people, highly educated people. This is a lot of people working in tech. This is a lot of people that have traveled abroad. This is people that are realizing how bad the war is, maybe have access to information about the war. But there's still a lot of people left. So when we consider where the holes in all of this, it really comes down to the effects of the war itself. So there's still a ton of secrecy surrounding Russian casualty counts in particular. The last time that the Russian Defense Ministry ever announced a total was a month ago. And so they said that roughly 1,300 soldiers have been killed and just over 3,000 have been injured. And they haven't updated that number. As of this week, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry said that 21,000 have been killed. The Pentagon estimates it somewhere between 10 and 15. I've seen numbers within that. So we're pretty confident that it's somewhere within this range. But it's not sure. And in the Q&A, I can talk about what we know about the 1,300 that have been openly declared to be dead. But when it comes to specific events, we're getting really weird information. So for example, the Moskva, which is Moscow in Russian, the Moskva was the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, and it was sunk by 2 Ukrainian missiles. The Russian military says that it caught fire and it sank when they were trying to bring it back to shore. In that account, though, no one that has a sailor on board has been able to contact their child. They cannot confirm, are you alive or dead? Russia has said that only 1 person has died and 27 are missing as of this week. There are estimates coming from the Ukrainian side that 40 died in the missile attack. This is a huge shift because for Russians, they've seen the flagship sink, at least in that fleet. And there's still questions around it. So we're starting to see a few holes pushed through as people want to know what's happening to my son on the front lines. But this has also shifted. The normal process by which Russian families can ask about the status of their child normally was done by civilian oversight. That has now moved exclusively to military oversight, and it's been put basically as confidential. So we have reports of someone being told that your son has been killed, then the defense ministry reaching out and saying, no, they're still alive, but you can't contact them and don't try. That is agony for that family. And so it's that absurdity that we're observing in this warfare, to where the ability for the Russian public to understand what's happening to our sons, even in this special military operation, they cannot tell. And what's worse is when we consider this overall effect, there are national level groups that normally advocate for veterans, that normally advocate for the mothers and fathers of those killed in war. Because of the new laws, they're not sure if they can say, let us bring our troops home. They think they might be arrested for saying these sorts of things. And so we don't see these national organizations really pushing against the state. And so fundamentally, it's come down to individual families, individuals seeking information, and we're increasingly seeing harassment around the Z. So this is, again, society turning on itself, even when there could be a social movement against this kind of lack of transparency. We're just not seeing it really materialize. So stepping away from the domestic Russian space, I wanted to talk a little bit about some ways that we're seeing the war in Ukraine really escalate in other ways. I know Dr. Och will be speaking a lot more about other aspects of sanctions, but in particular, when we think about food and fertilizer prices, this is where we're going to see some things over this summer. So Russia is the world's largest fertilizer and grain exporter. Ukraine is the world's 2nd largest grain exporter. Together, we estimate that 12% of the calories in food traded globally are from these 2 states. So the war is impacting their ability to export. Ukraine basically only has 1 major port that is still functioning, Odessa, its largest, but still, the war in Eastern Ukraine is the breadbasket for Ukraine. So we're thinking that Ukraine will likely not have a good harvest. Russia might also have a lackluster harvest, just given everything going on in its economy. So we're seeing a tightening of the market, but we're also seeing other reasons. China is on track to have the worst wheat harvest ever in history. And that's a quote from their agricultural minister. Now they have plenty in reserves. China's not going to go into hunger, but because of a bad harvest, they are going to be buying far more on the world market. Now we're worried about demand really catching up with supply. And so we've begun to see this overall. And so food prices have hit the highest on the international scale. The average is the highest we've ever seen since 1990 when we first started to measure it. So to give you a sense of where prices are, so the 100 is, if we take the years of 2014 to 2016, that's our baseline for prices. So we can see that 2019 was pretty good for food prices. 2020, we can see some volatility, and that makes sense with the COVID crisis. There was some volatility in food prices. But looking at 2021, we are getting steadily increasing prices, and already this year, this is the global average. And so when we think about the world's poorest populations, they spend nearly 40 to 60% of their income on food alone. So the price shift of a few pennies in any direction really affects our ability to get sufficient calories. So we're very worried about world hunger at this point in time, and especially these sorts of prices. We're already seeing some of this here at home, but on a global average, it's really taking off, and it might not get better over the summer. So this is something we should all pay attention to. But thinking of sanctions, at this point in time, there is what I would argue the big sanction question, which is how do we coexist in the medium to long term with Russia and the world market under Putin's administration? Imagine that the war ended tonight. We suddenly all got a text, some sort of push notification that the war ended. How quickly do we let Russia back into the world economy? How quickly do we forgive? That is a huge question. And that obviously, it ending tonight is not going to happen. And so there's this idea of how does the world market move on? How do we manage and maintain these sanctions? And I would argue, along with others, that technology is honestly one of the best advantages we have in the long term. A good recent example, the Finnish and Swedish cell phone companies of Nokia and Ericsson exited the Russian market. These were the two firms tasked with basically updating all of Russia's cell phone towers. So they're going to have older and older cellular telecommunications, but also these companies can't send them spare parts anymore. So this is something where as things break, they can't get repaired. And so this is a way where we can really see a breaking down or at least a technological slow of Russian society. Similarly, under the current sanctions, you cannot use Microsoft products. You cannot utilize the cloud. You cannot utilize Oracle. So basically, most things working on the international web can't work. That is a great way to possibly isolate Russia in the long term. Similarly, because of not only all the people leaving, but also Russia used to be a great spot to pick up some coders to help you develop your app fairly cheaply by comparison to Western norms. That's no longer a possibility. And it also limits Russia's military capacity. Fundamentally, Russia still relies on a lot of Western technology and a lot of Western products to maintain guided missiles, to maintain a lot of their radio systems. So this can be something where over time, even if the war ended tomorrow and we wanted to be a little stingy with technology, that would be a way to possibly isolate Russia and prevent it from being able to really continue to compete on a global stage. So this should be something when we think about this big question, this is going to come up a lot because we've seen the effects of it. So, to the bigger question of, isn't this genocide? Because I know President Biden has mentioned it, a number of other officials have mentioned it, and this is a tricky question in a sense, but the answer is no. And that is because of our standard definition in international law. Many activists, many scholars say that it's a bad definition, that it simply is too high of a bar, and only a handful of the genocides that we know of in modern history would qualify. And so therefore it is a bad definition. But in this definition currently, one of the things that it requires is that you have to have evidence that it is state policy and state intent. That is difficult to prove. We do have cases, for example, in Srebrenica, in the Bosnian crisis, there was Directive 7. We had evidence that this was a state intent to use mass atrocities. If we don't have that document, if we don't have that radio broadcast, we might not be able to prove this crime. So that is already difficult. On top of that, the violence does appear to be indiscriminate. And that could fall under genocide potentially, but if it's indiscriminate, if it's not state policy, we're falling quite short of that definition. And by extension, we're also falling short of the definition of ethnic cleansing. So more than likely, what we've been observing fall into the category of crimes against humanity and war crimes. But there are other loopholes. Reporting suggests that mercenaries and other non-state actors have really been behind the atrocities. So for example, the Wagner Group. This has been one of Russia's primary mercenary groups, tied very closely to Putin's inner circle. They've operated in the Central African Republic, in Syria, and we've interacted with them before. When we were much more engaged in the Syrian crisis, we bombed a group of soldiers. We found out later that they were 300 Russians, all part of the Wagner Group. That never came up in diplomatic circles because the whole point is that it's a private group. It's off the books. It can't be considered an act of war. It's to provide deniability, to remove liability. What we have evidence of, at least in reporting that I've seen, is that in the advancement to Kyiv, for example, the Russian forces, when they overtook the suburb of Bucha, that initially it was regular forces basically occupying the town, and then regular forces moved on, and mercenary groups like the Wagner group moved in, and that's when we started to see the indiscriminate violence. So that can be a loophole that Russia's taking advantage of. That if a private group is doing the atrocities, then we can't be held responsible. So that is a possible murky way in which they're doing things. Similarly, to bring any charges of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, that has to go through the UN Security Council. Russia is a permanent 5 member, it can veto it. So none of those will actually be utilized. So the UN Security Council de facto is useless in this situation. So what can we do? There is the International Criminal Court. Since 2002, it's tasked with trying individuals for these grave crimes. So it's trying to go around the state. So for example, the ICC can start an investigation of a sitting world leader, and it can provide evidence. And if the international community, in terms of pressure, it might be to a case where the government is willing to give up that person and have them be tried for war crimes rather than the whole country be isolated and suffer. So this is a way to try to make the elites responsible for their crimes. In this case, however, Russia has not ratified the treaty, and so the ICC has no authority. So they can't do this. And when it comes to the frustration that this feels, a lot of my students in my classes feel this way. But this is where we have to acknowledge a very dark truth. The US also has not ratified this statute. We also have the protection of the UN Security Council. And this has come up before numerous times. In Abu Ghraib, when it came to black site torture, this came up. Surely the US should be tried for crimes against humanity, for war crimes. When we think about the use of mercenaries and contractors, in our operations in Iraq, mercenaries and contractors made up 50% of that, not US troops. So we often used private forces and used that legal gray zone. And in that way, some of the groups like Blackwater have been accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and we have not let the ICC have any authority, and we've used the UN Security Council to block investigations. So when it comes to this international system, the US pioneered some of the legal gray zone, and Russia is taking advantage of that. So when it comes to how we behave in the international system, this is one of those cases where it matters how we behave. So overall, the last thing I want to say is that this war is very contentious. A considerable portion of the non-Western world are either neutral or supportive of Russia. Currently, the governments that represent nearly 2/3 of the world's population are either neutral or in support of Russia. Only 1/3 of the world's population is represented by governments that have actively decried or refused to support the war. So when we think about maintaining this international pressure, we have to consider that this isn't an overwhelmingly popular thing. That there's a lot of views around the world that this is the West in our hypocrisy. That we support Ukrainian refugees, but not Iraqi, not Yemeni, not Irani, the list goes on of populations that we have not extended the kind of support that we're offering to Ukrainian refugees. It's seen that why are we angry at Russia when the US did this just 20 years before? Why do we isolate them? Similarly, there's an accusation that in Western institutions, where are they seizing the yachts and the penthouses of the Russian oligarchs? It's in London, it's in Miami, it's in Italy. The West is complicit in facilitating the kleptocracy that exists in Russia and Ukraine for that matter. And so it's really seen as this is the West getting their comeuppance. They're finally getting what they're due. And so there's a lot of neutrality. But when we also think around the world, Russia supplies 100% of the fertilizer to East Africa. They don't want to mess with Russia. They need that fertilizer. When we think about the Middle East, Russia supplies 70% of the grain to Egypt. Egypt doesn't want that disrupted. So when we think about other areas around the world, they're more dependent on Russia than we are. And so we're not going to see just full-throated support for the US or the West. We talk a lot about the EU and NATO, but there's a lot of the world to go. So in crafting our future steps, that's just something we have to be careful of. that we cannot go too far too fast, because we could be shutting out parts of the world and access to critical things that they need, like food. So this is something that as we move forward, we just have to be aware of. So on that note, I'm going to conclude my presentation, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Och.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you.
So thanks for having me. I was very excited when you reached out and said, hey, do you want to team up? Can you hear me? Are people complaining online? No? Cool. So,
Not yet.
Not yet? Just wait a second. Okay, so I'm originally from Germany. I don't look German, so don't get confused. My mom is Thai, my dad is German. But I was born and raised in Germany until I was 15 years. It's my 15 years anniversary in the US. Yay! When the war started, I immediately thought about the European consequences. And as Dr. Johnson can attest, there were a lot of enraged texts that I sent him when watching American TV because of its very, yes?
I'm seeing not this on the Zoom.
Got it. Keep going.
All right. When I was watching American TV, because I felt that the European perspective was really missing from the conversation. So I want to spend a little bit of time today to talk about what the Ukraine war has actually meant for Europe. Because we often focus like, how can we stop the war? But the war has also led to fundamental changes in Europe, and most specifically in Germany, where it had led to watershed moments that 3 months ago, I would have laughed at everyone who had thought, who had suggested even a discussion about this. So just to give you a little overview, I'm going to first focus on Germany, but then I also want to take a little bit of time to actually focus on the European Union, its responses and what it means. Especially, you might have heard a little bit of talk about Ukraine wanting to join the European Union. How realistic is that in the end? So what is happening in Germany? Germany, when the war started, the new German chancellor, we have a new chancellor. I know you're all used to Merkel, but after 60 years, she is out of power. Well, she retired, the first chancellor to do so. And we now have Olaf Scholz from the Social Democratic Party. And when the Ukraine war started, he gave a speech in the German parliament talking about a Zeitenwende, which essentially means a change of time, but it's like a tidal wave of changes coming to Germany. And these are two front pages from the two major national magazines like The Times or The Economist. And this one says, warrior against his will. The other one says, Zeitenwende. Why Putin's attack on Ukraine made the unthinkable thinkable. So before the Ukraine war, since World War II ended, there was a strict policy of keeping the German military to humanitarian engagements and peacekeeping missions. They did not, for example, participate in the Iraq Alliance of the Willing, and they usually do. There was even a big discussion whether they would join the Afghan war after NATO's Article 5, is that? Yes, was declared after 9/11. So as a result, the German army has been severely underfunded, is often technologically outdated, and doesn't have enough supply as a modern army actually would need. In addition, there's a strict German policy that arms are not delivered into war zones or areas of crises. And this policy is very extensive. So if Germany sells weapons to the Netherlands then sells the weapons to Sweden, and Sweden wants to sell the same German weapons to, give me a time, so Myanmar, Germany, they have to get permission from the German government to do so. And if the German government says, no, there's a Rohingya crisis, you're not giving these weapons that are originally from Germany to Myanmar, they are not allowed to transfer those weapons. So there was a really strict, we are not delivering arms and no one else can if the weapons were made in Germany. So you might ask yourself, or not, it's pretty obvious, there's a historical background to it. So Germany is responsible for 2 world wars. The first one, this one is World War I. You can see the Prussian soldiers, and the Second World War, of course, under Nazis, under Hitler leadership. So as a result of the World War II, really turned Germany into a pacifist nation, where we had a Supreme Court case about whether it's legal to say soldiers are murderers, and it was declared, yes, it is. Like the German uniform is gray, really ugly, not imposing, looks a little bit sad. So everything was done to make the military something we had to have, but not something to be proud of, nothing that we wanted to use, and simply pacifist in all its orientation. This is particularly important today because the coalition government who's now in power are the Social Democrats and the Greens. Both parties are peace parties. They are pacifist parties who have always voted against Germans' involvement in any types of armed conflicts unless it was really genocide or really pressing issues. So this poster, the campaign poster says, vote for peace. This one says, priority for civil stuff. This one says, prevent violence, promote peace. So those 2 parties, who are now the 2 biggest parties in parliament, really have had this peace agenda. So they are really, really challenged by what is happening in the reality of the war in Ukraine.
I remember split is what I did. There you go, sorry.
Men.
Checks out.
So then Chancellor Scholz talked about Zeitenwende, this epochal change of times. What does it mean? So domestically means for the first time, there's a conscious decision to actually increase defense spending, ironically, exactly to the percentage that Trump wanted Germany to increase under for NATO. So defense spending is increased by 2%. And at the same time, Germany made available 200 billion euros for a special fund to immediately modernize the German military. There will be nuclear sharing agreements and armed drones. I cannot stress enough how earth-shattering this is. I could not believe that. Like goes against everything I grew up with, everything I was taught in school, and my dad worked his whole life for the European Defense Agency. But even then, this is we have drones, but they are not armed. The fact that we now are going to have armed drones is almost I asked a couple of friends, how do you feel about this? And they were like, I don't know. There's a lot of you need to, but you should be. So there's a lot of internal tension about these decisions. At the same time, for the foreign policy, what it meant is to actually deliver weapons to Ukraine. That was when Scholz, the chancellor, announced this was a watershed. Because Ukraine is a war zone. Germany doesn't do that. And the coalition agreement actually specifies that there will not be arms delivered into crises in war zones. So as some of you might know, in parliamentary systems such as Germany, you don't break the coalition agreement. It's usually a sign that the government is done and you need to have new elections. So the fact that the coalition came again is okay, we have to do it is really important. And Germany stepped up and said, okay, we're going to take leadership and provide the NATO structure and support and troops for the eastern flank of NATO. Again, something that is very unusual to see under German leadership. But not so fast. Germans are very responsible and slow-moving. Actually, they're not slow-moving enough. Very efficient, but very considerate. So if we compare who's actually giving weapons to Ukraine, Germany isn't a big donor in that sense. The US provides the majority of weapons. And the other day when I was listening to German news on that, they actually said the amount of heavy weaponry of a specific kind, I think it was drones, that the US is promising to Ukraine is more than the German army even has for its own purposes. So that just gives you an idea. So, and Germany has received a lot of criticism how slow they're moving in realizing those promises under the Zeitenwende. But we have some complicating factors. The guy, the gentleman, he's not really a gentleman, but the person in the middle is former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who's best friends with Putin and also sits on the boards of several gas companies in Russia. He has been notably quiet since lately. And he's also a social democrat, so the same party that is currently in power. On the other side, you can see social democrat Steinberg. Oh my God. Brain fart. Steinbrück. Oh my God.
Sure.
No, let's pretend I said a name. He's the current president of Germany, but he was a ceremonial position. Also very close to Putin. The Social Democrats overall, as many other parties on the left, have pursued over the last decades policy that really centered on keeping communications open with Russia, seeing them as a reliable partner, which is most notable through the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipeline that was supposed to happen right before the war started. Only because of the war, Germany said, well, I guess we're not doing the pipeline anymore. So the Social Democrats have a long history of engagement with Russia, especially friendly to Putin. So they are also now struggling on, they come to grips with the failure of that policy that clearly backfired. Steinmeier, thank you. It was a compound word. So what can we make of this Zeitenwende? Has it really led to anything? Germany has been increasingly criticized for its reluctance to deliver weapons. They were trying to come, like first they were like, you were giving weapons, and then suddenly they were taking off specific heavy weaponry and tanks. They're like, no, we're not going to give those. And then they were like, well, Slovenia could give them their tanks, and then we'll give newer tanks to Slovenia, and that way we could do it. So Western allies really became increasingly frustrated with the chancellor, including members of his own coalition parties that were really trying to push him to just come out and say what needs to be done and actually follow it. So this is a front page of a German newspaper. It's like, oh, it's a very scandalous newspaper. And it says the tanking bluffing of the chancellor, what the government is all not giving to Ukraine. And this is how he tricked them with the list of weapons. So even German people are going to the streets asking the government to actually give heavy weaponry to Ukraine. Instead, what we see, the chancellor is really emphasizing humanitarian assistance, welcoming refugees, helping this, and no one is criticizing Germany for that, but at this point, Germany really needs to step up and embrace the fact that it's the biggest country in Europe, that the economic motor of the European Union, and they need to step up. But then you still see this uneasiness with the pacifism, the history of World War II, and getting engaged in a war. But breaking news this morning, I'm glad I checked Twitter. I double checked right now when Colin was talking, sorry. Germany finally has made a promise. The Secretary of Defense said that Germany will indeed bring in Cheeto tanks. They're named after Cheetos, I don't know why. And they committed to delivering a certain number of it, and then there will be more. This is a big change. It took forever. In the beginning, Germany was mocked because they sent several thousand of helmets to Ukraine. I think that's helpful, right? So this is, again, a watershed moment. We'll see how long it will take. and how fast those tanks will go. But it's also important to note that these tanks are not coming from the German military, but it's German defense companies who have used ones that the German government okays to send to Ukraine. So it's not coming out of the German military budget. My gut says me Germany might not be able to give those tanks because they don't have enough to maintain a functioning army. But of course, the Bundeswehr is not going to come out like, well, you know, we can't do that because otherwise we're defenseless. But then I have no proof of this. It's just my assessment of the situation. So what does this mean for Germany? It's really difficult to tell where Germany will go. There's a lot of discussion online right now what this decision to send tanks actually means for Germany, if this opens the door for more delivery for heavier weapons even further down the road. And there's a deep fear in German society that also some of my friends have shared with me that this could be seen as being part of the war and Germany could be next. So this constant fear of having an extension of World War III is certainly there. So moving on from Germany to the European Union. Europe, again, something I could not believe, came out strong, decisive, united, like not the European Union I know, because they take forever, they fight a lot, they argue a lot, and then they come up with a not so great compromise, usually. But this time, within hours, they were there, they had a plan, they were united. And that was impressive. At the core of this is the European Peace Facility, which amounts to now 1.5 billion euros. It has been upped up several times, so it might be increased even further. I did not check Twitter if something has changed, so they might have counted against me. But they also decided to send personal protective equipment to Ukraine, first aid kits, fuel, and military equipment. And the military equipment, again, is really important because normally Germany would have blocked that decision of the EU, but did not this time. The Green Minister of, what is it called in the US? Secretary of State. She even called for heavy weapons to be delivered to Ukraine, which is again usual because she's from the Green Party. So when we look at where Russia exports its gas and oil, we can see that the EU is actually in a pretty good position because over half of Russian oil and gas imports, there's a comparison, goes to the European countries. So an oil and gas embargo would be great, but spoiler alert, there is none. So why is that the case? Well, first, if you look at EU policies, so the goal of all the sanctions that the EU has agreed to was to cripple Kremlin's ability to finance the war, impose political and economic costs that make it too costly to wage the war, and also diminish its economic base. But I love this little cartoon because the European Union is so dependent on Russia that it cannot really go where it hurts the most for the Russian economy, which is oil and gas exports. So if you look at the EU gas imports, you can tell that Russia is a big part of where the EU gets its gas from. And there are varying dependencies on Russian gas based on EU countries. So North Macedonia is not in the European Union officially, but it's a European country. So you see a lot of the Balkan states, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, 100% dependency on Russian gas. Finland, Latvia, but also Germany, 49% of Germany, so half of Germany's gas imports are coming from Russia. So Germany has been very reluctant to support any form of gas embargo. However, breaking news, I didn't have time to make a slide because it was that new. Russia just announced that it will cut off the gas delivery to Bulgaria and Poland because they're not paying them in the ruble. And it's supposed to happen tomorrow. So who knows? Stay tuned. We don't know yet what's going to happen. But that certainly it also shores up fears in Europe. So one of the fears is because they're not really good alternatives to where to get gas from. yes, liquefied gas is one way to go, but the facilities to import liquefied gas and use it and transport it are not very advanced in Europe. They are trying to accelerate that process, but it takes a while. But it's also only some part of gas. And then if you look at the other countries that could supply potentially gas, not all of them are that much better in terms of human rights and political conditions than Russia. So Algeria, Nigeria, Qatar, these are all countries that.
I was just because I can't trust Norway.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're not in the European Union. So. But these are all countries that are potentially political unrest and war, can also impact gas. So where do we go from here? The similar situation is with oil. If you look at oil companies, most of it, again, comes from Russia. And this is the wrong slide because it looks the same, so ignore that. But just believe me that as gas, oil is also Germany is one of the biggest importers of Russian oil. And again, they are very different dependency on Russian oil. And that often explains why some countries are more willing to do gas and oil sanctions than others. Because it's easy to say, yes, let's sanction EU and Russian gas or oil if only 10 or 20% of your gas or oil comes from Russia. It's a different story if it's 50% or more. And similar to gas, it's really complicated to know, or like, how can we really replace Russian oil supply? And again, not that great of options. The United States, yes, but Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Venezuela, they might also be in a position to increase their output of oil to such an extent to make up for Russian oil. So it again puts everyone in Europe in a pickle. Of course, we have alternative energy sources, and Germany and others have been really at the forefront of pushing more renewable energy, especially wind systems. However, it's simply not enough. Like, we cannot get there. The other problem is that Germany specifically has agreed to a nuclear exit by this year, actually, 2022. The last remaining 3 nuclear plants will be shut off, and Germany will no longer rely on nuclear power. So this was a very broad common consensus. Nuclear power is very contested in Germany, and the majority of people believe we should not rely on nuclear power. So it's like an anti-nuclear demonstration. Important, they are signed for the Social Democrats and the Greens. So now we suddenly have discussions whether we can actually keep the 3 remaining nuclear plants longer on the grid, or if we might have to fire up the 3 that were put into retirement last year. Again, something that we've never had even as a potential discussion going on, but what the Ukraine war has changed. But the short story here is it's not enough. So finally, accession to the European Union. So Ukraine has always pushed to be included in NATO and European Union as a way to follow their attachment to the West. And the first step to become a member of the European Union is to become a candidacy country. However, from candidate status to accession, what the European Union calls membership, like being agreed to become a member, it takes years. Like 3 to 6 years or longer, depending where your country starts from. And the Copenhagen criteria are the ones determine whether a country is ready to become an EU member. And there are 3 factors: political factors, you have to have the rule of law, free democracy, human rights, minority rights protection. Economic factors, you need to have a free market, and your free market needs to be in shape to withstand the competition forces within a European market. And then each potential candidate country needs to implement the acquis communautaire, which essentially is all the laws and policies that the EU has and need to be implemented into domestic law and harmonized with domestic law. And the reality is that Ukraine is simply not there. Even without the war, it is a long way for them to get to meet the Copenhagen criteria, whether it is of limited press freedom before the war, because oligarchs do control some of the media, whether it's corruption, question about the judiciary or elections. There was just a lot of things there are two. Nevertheless, when Ursula von der Leyen and the EU commissioner, which is kind of the top person in the EU, went to visit Ukraine, she actually brought the EU questionnaire to start candidacy status and to Zelensky, and he filled it out, and the EU is supposed to vote on it in June. But it is not a short-term solution. It's more long-term and maybe giving hope to a country in war, knowing that it's a complicated and long and lasting process. So finally, question is, where does Europe go from here? We see a more united Europe. How long it can last, we don't know. Right before the war, Poland, Hungary were in hot waters with the European Union for their illiberal regime. And I don't even want to say weak judiciary, non-existing judiciary, I would say almost. So essentially they got a break by the Ukraine war. And as of Sunday night, at least, thank you, France, Macron won re-election. If Marine Le Pen of the far-right party had won, that would have been support of Putin in the French presidency. So at least we did good. France we voted a Europeanist back in the Europe. And the key questions that Europe, especially Germany, has to answer is how much are they willing to suffer for peace? Like how many of economic sanctions and tightness and uncomfortableness are they willing to take up in order to push for more peace in Europe? So, and I'm going to stop it there and then hand it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you.